Theodore Robert Bundy, better known as Ted Bundy, is one of the most famous and controversial serial killers of the 20th century. His name has become synonymous with charm, manipulation, and hidden cruelty, concealed behind the mask of an intelligent and attractive man. Born on November 24th, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, he lived in an atmosphere of lies from the very beginning. His mother presented herself as his sister, and he was raised by his grandparents. When Bundy learned the truth about his origins, it was one of the first shocks that affected his psyche and subsequent personality distortion. From his youth, Ted stood out for his intelligence, discipline, and charm. But behind this facade lay a cold, emotional detachment. He studied psychology, was interested in law, actively participated in public life, was attractive, and knew how to make an impression. However, in his private life, he stole, peeped at women, and was fascinated by reading about violence and murder, as if seeking justification for his growing dark thoughts. By the mid-1970s, Ted Bundy had become one of America's most dangerous criminals. His first attacks took place in Washington, where he lured women under the pretext of helping them, pretending to be injured, wearing a cast, asking them to carry books or things to his car. When the victim agreed, he attacked, stunned, and kidnapped her. Over the years, his crimes spread across several states: Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. His modus operandi was characterized by meticulousness and cold-bloodedness. He chose young women with long hair who looked similar to each other, supposedly reminding him of his first love, who had abandoned him in his youth. The exact number of his victims is still unknown. Bundy confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe there could have been more than 100. His crimes became the embodiment of narcissism and the pursuit of power. He enjoyed manipulation, hunting, and fear. His arrest in 1975 in Salt Lake City was accidental. Police stopped his car and found a mask, handcuffs, and ropes. Despite suspicions, there was no direct evidence, and he managed to temporarily avoid punishment. In 1977, Bundy escaped custody twice. After his second escape, he made his way to Florida, where he committed one of his most brutal crimes: an attack on the Chi Omega sorority house, which resulted in the deaths of 2 women. He then killed several more women before being arrested again. Bundy's trial became a national sensation. He represented himself in court, skillfully manipulated the press, and even elicited sympathy from some observers. His charm and confidence contrasted with the horrific details of his crimes. But there was irrefutable evidence against him: dental impressions, blood traces. In 1980, the court sentenced Ted Bundy to death. In prison, he remained calm and calculating. He gave interviews, discussed the motives behind his actions, and remained convinced of his own exceptionality until the end. In his final years, he attempted to delay his execution by confessing to new murders in hopes of gaining time. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. He died without apparent remorse, only in the last days of his life speaking about the influence of childhood trauma and pornography on his consciousness. After his death, Ted Bundy's name became a symbol of evil, hidden behind a mask of attractiveness. And his personality continues to attract the interest of psychologists, writers, and filmmakers to this day, too. Daniel Harold Rawling, born on May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, grew up in a family where fear and violence reigned. His father, a Korean War veteran and police officer,
was a hot-tempered and violent man who kept his family in a constant state of tension. His mother tried to leave several times but always returned. Rolling's childhood was marked by humiliation and fear. He grew up as a withdrawn child, craving love but receiving only punishment. Once, his father killed the boy's beloved pet, which finally closed Danny off and intensified his inner isolation. As an adult, he was unable to find his place in society. He lost his job, committed petty crimes, and ended up behind bars several times. In the spring of 1990, after a conflict with his father, he shot him and fled his hometown. From that moment on, a period began that would later be called one of the most terrifying in Florida's history.
From the end of August 1990, a series of attacks took place in the student town of Gainesville, claiming the lives of 5 students. All the crimes were characterized by cold calculation and similar preparation. The investigation noted that the perpetrator acted deliberately, leaving no random traces. The victims, young people who were just starting their independent lives, became symbols of a tragedy that shook the entire state. Panic swept through the city. Educational institutions were temporarily closed, and thousands of students left their campuses. The investigation, which involved the state's best investigators, did not yield results for a long time. However, the police's attention was soon drawn to an unsolved crime committed a year earlier in Louisiana, where similarities in the details were also noted. These coincidences became the key to solving the case. A Shreveport resident, Cindy Urasich, gave the police the name of a suspect, Danny Rolling. He was arrested on September 7, 1990, for robbing a supermarket in Ocala. A search of his car and belongings found items that pointed to a possible connection to the crimes, and DNA analysis confirmed the investigators' suspicions. At trial, Rolling stated that he wanted to go down in history and become as famous as other criminals of the past. He was found sane despite his psychiatric history. In 1994, he pleaded guilty, which allowed him to avoid lengthy legal proceedings. The sentence was death. While in prison, he collaborated with writer Sandra London, recounting his past and motives. His calm, confident, and even artistic manner of communication evoked mixed feelings among the public. On October 25, 2006, 16 years after his arrest, Danny Rolling was executed. In his final moments, he sang a religious hymn, asked for forgiveness, and mentioned 3 other crimes he had committed earlier in Louisiana. His last words were addressed to God, but for many, his sincerity remained in doubt. Daniel Harold Rolling, born on May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, grew up in a family where fear and violence reigned. His father, a Korean War veteran and police officer, was a hot-tempered and violent man who kept his family in a constant state of tension. His mother tried to leave several times, but always returned. Rolling's childhood was marked by humiliation and fear. He grew up as a withdrawn child, craving love but receiving only punishment. Once, his father killed the boy's beloved pet, which completely closed Danny off and intensified his inner isolation. As an adult, he was unable to find his place in society. He lost his job, committed petty crimes, and ended up behind bars several times. In the spring of 1990, after another conflict with his father, he shot him and fled his hometown. From that moment on, a period began that would later be called one of the most terrifying in Florida's history.
Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was born on March 26, 1946, in Neenah, Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by constant psychological pressure. His father, a hot-tempered and strict man, often humiliated his son, making him feel inferior. His mother, on the other hand, was gentle and caring,
but unable to protect her children from her husband's anger. These contradictions left a deep mark on Schaefer's character, shaping him into a cold, secretive person with a need to control those around him. As a teenager, he exhibited disturbing traits. He craved power and domination, dreamed of recognition, but did not know how to build healthy relationships. As an adult, Schaefer often changed jobs. He tried his hand at teaching, but never stayed anywhere for long. Later, he decided to devote his life to law enforcement and joined the police force. His colleagues described him as a disciplined person, but with a clear tendency to moralize and a desire to demonstrate superiority. When he was appointed deputy sheriff of Martin County, no one suspected that beneath the officer's uniform was a man capable of abusing his power. On July 23, 1972, while on duty, Schaefer stopped two young female hitchhikers and offered to take them to a safe place. He then committed acts that horrified his victims, but they managed to escape and report the incident to the police. Schaefer was arrested, but soon released on bail. A few weeks later, another tragedy occurred. Two girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, disappeared, and their bodies were later found in a wooded area. The investigation determined that the same person was involved in the crime. The investigation led the police to Schaefer. Personal belongings of the missing women, documents, and other items related to them were found in his house and garage. The most striking discovery was made during a search of his mother's house.
There, investigators found hundreds of pages of manuscripts in which Schaefer described scenes that matched the circumstances of the actual crimes. Among the findings were photographs, notes, and recordings reflecting his obsessive ideas. This evidence became decisive in the case. In September 1973, the trial began, attracting enormous public interest. Prosecutor Robert Stone described the defendant as a dangerous individual who used his position to act on his impulses. Although Florida did not have the death penalty at the time, the court found Gerard Schaefer guilty of 2 murders and sentenced him to 2 life terms. In prison, he tried to create an image of an intellectual. He wrote stories, claiming that they were works of art, not confessions. He corresponded with the writer Sandra London and claimed that his texts were literary therapy. However, investigators believed that some of these stories were based on real events. Some experts believe that he may have been responsible for significantly more crimes than officially established. On December 3rd, 1995, Gerard Schaefer was found dead in his cell. His death was the result of a conflict with another inmate. Oscar Ray Bolin Jr., born on January 22nd, 1962, in Portland, Indiana, grew up in a poor and unstable family. His parents earned money doing odd jobs and seasonal work at carnivals, constantly moving from place to place. The atmosphere of instability, conflict, and humiliation shaped the boy's difficult perception of the world. His father often used violence, and his mother humiliated him publicly. One such episode would later be called a turning point in the formation of his character. Investigators and psychologists later noted that it was his childhood trauma that formed the basis of his vengeful and aggressive nature. Bolin's teenage years were marked by law-breaking. He was arrested for the first time at the age of 15, and by the age of 20, he had an impressive list of offenses. In the early 1980s, he moved to Florida, where he found work at a traveling carnival. There, he met a girl named Cheryl Huffner. Their relationship was turbulent and conflictual. Outbursts of jealousy and aggression became more and more frequent. In 1982, she reported him to the police for kidnapping, but the charges were later dropped.
A year later, the couple got married, but married life only increased the tension between them. By 1986, Bolin was already known for his quick temper. On January 25th of that year, he committed his first murder. His victim was 25-year-old Natalie Hawley, a restaurant manager in Tampa. After finishing her shift, she headed home but never made it. In the morning, her body was found, and the nature of the crime shocked investigators. A few months later, 17-year-old Stephanie Collins, a local school student, disappeared. A month later, her body was found with signs of violence. On the same evening that Collins' body was discovered, Bolin committed another attack. 26-year-old Terry Lynn Matthews disappeared on her way home from work, and her car was found running at a post office. The girl was later found in a remote area. The investigation noted the striking similarities between all three incidents: spontaneity, the use of fabric to conceal the bodies, blows to the head, and the overall ritualistic nature. These details suggested that one person was behind the series of attacks. Despite the obvious similarities between the crimes, the investigation was unable to identify the attacker for a long time. It was only years later that the investigation yielded results. In 1987, Bolin was arrested in Ohio for kidnapping a young woman. The attempted attack failed. The victim managed to escape, and Bolin was sentenced to a long prison term. While in prison, he was exposed thanks to a chain of unexpected events. His ex-wife told her new husband that Bolin had confessed to her about the murders committed in Florida. The husband reported this to the police, and an investigation began. Key witnesses included not only Huffner, but also Bolin's stepbrother, who claimed to have seen him try to drown one of the victims. His cousin also said that he had helped him kidnap a woman in Texas, 30-year-old Deborah Stowe. Although no charges were brought in this case, the investigation painted a complete picture of his criminal activities. In July 1991, the court found Bolin guilty of the murder of Natalie Hawley and sentenced him to death. 2 more similar sentences followed for the murders of Collins and Matthews. He became one of the few prisoners to receive a triple death sentence. Throughout his time in prison, Bolin denied his guilt, claiming that he was the victim of false testimony and family intrigues. However, the courts repeatedly upheld the verdict. The day before his execution, he gave an interview in which he appeared calm and confident, stating that death would be a liberation for him after 28 years in prison.
On January 7, 2016, in a Florida prison, the sentence was carried out. Bolin did not utter any last words. By the time of his death, he had become one of the most famous figures among Florida criminals of the 1980s.
Gary Ray Bowles, born on January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia, was surrounded by poverty, fear, and cruelty from the very beginning of his life. His father, Frank Bowles, a coal miner, died of lung disease before he was born, leaving the family without support or means of subsistence. His mother, Frances, tried her best to make a life for herself, marrying several times. But each new stepfather brought only more quarrels and beatings into the home. His mother's second husband, who suffered from alcoholism, abused her and the children. When Gary turned 13, he fought back for the first time, hitting his stepfather so hard that he ended up in the hospital. However, his mother did not support her son and stayed with her husband. After that, Gary ran away from home, beginning a life of loneliness and wandering. As a teenager, he ended up on the streets, surviving on odd jobs. During this period, he became dependent on the kindness of strangers and his own fears. His life soon turned into a series of nights in cheap motels, street encounters, and a constant search for money. Internal conflicts Shame and feelings of rejection formed anger within him, which over the years became a destructive force. In 1982, Bowles was arrested for assaulting a girl and spent 6 years in prison. After his release in 1991, he was tried again for robbing an elderly woman and received another 4 years. By the time he was released, he was seething with a mixture of rage, envy, and a desire to take revenge on the world. In the spring of 1994, that hatred came to a head. In Daytona Beach, Florida, Bowles met 59-year-old John Hardy Roberts, a man who showed him compassion and offered him a place to stay. However, later that night, Bowles attacked him, killed him, and took his bank cards, which he then used to withdraw money while traveling between Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. The police quickly found his fingerprints, but he managed to escape.
In the following months, he continued to commit crimes. His victims included men of various ages, ranging from 30 to 70, whom he befriended by promising help or companionship, and then attacked. His actions combined personal aggression and greed. He took money and valuables to continue his escape. Investigators noted that his motive was not only financial gain. Bowles was driven by inner hatred and feelings of humiliation. The FBI included him in its list of the 10 most wanted criminals in the country, offering a large reward for his capture. He was sought throughout the southeastern United States. He was finally arrested on November 22nd, 1994, in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. His last victim was 42-year-old Walter Jamel J. Hinton. After his arrest, Bowles calmly confessed to 6 murders and told investigators, "I'm just tired of living." In May 1996, the court found Bowles guilty of Hinton's murder and sentenced him to death. 2 more similar sentences followed later.
The defense tried to prove that his childhood, constant abuse, and poverty had affected his mental state. But the court considered these circumstances insufficient to mitigate the punishment. Bowles was nicknamed the I-95 killer because he traveled along that highway, choosing victims from among those who trusted or helped him. The Florida Supreme Court once overturned the sentence, pointing to the influence of the prosecution's emotional arguments. But in 1999, the death penalty was reinstated. Bowles spent the next 20 years in prison, where he kept to himself and avoided contact with others. He gave almost no interviews and wrote only once in a letter to a priest, "I wasn't born a monster. I was made one." David Allen Gore, born on August 21, 1953, in Vero Beach, Florida, showed troubling personality traits from an early age: secretiveness, manipulative behavior, and an obsessive interest in women. He grew up in a strict, emotionally cold family where neither openness nor displays of affection were encouraged. As a teenager, he was fired from a gas station after the owner noticed that he was secretly peeping at female customers. This incident was the first warning sign of his tendency to violate other people's personal boundaries. As an adult, Gore sought respect and recognition by joining the Indian River County Sheriff's Office. Working in law enforcement gave him a sense of power and control. Exactly what he had always sought. However, discipline and moral responsibility were foreign to him. Beneath his outward politeness and neatness lay a man whose inner impulses were becoming increasingly dangerous. During those same years, Gore became particularly close to his cousin, Fred Waterfield, a confident and charismatic man who had come to Florida from New Jersey. A strange, codependent friendship developed between them, based on shared fantasies and a thirst for risk. Over time, this alliance turned into a criminal partnership. Gore took on the role of organizer, while Waterfield helped him plan and cover his tracks. From 1981 to 1983, women began to disappear in Indian River County. The victims were both local residents and casual travelers. Investigations yielded no results. The crimes seemed unrelated, and there was no evidence. Meanwhile, Gore had already attracted the attention of the police. He was fired from his position as a deputy sheriff after complaints, and later arrested for trespassing on private property. After a short prison term, he was released, and a new series of disappearances soon followed. In the summer of 1983, everything changed.
An eyewitness reported suspicious activity near Gore's home, and the police decided to check it out. During the search and interrogations, investigators found evidence linking him to several disappearances. Under the weight of the evidence, Gore confessed and indicated the locations where the bodies were hidden. His stories astonished investigators. He spoke calmly, in detail, and without a trace of remorse. The trial, which began in 1984, became one of the most high-profile in Florida. The press quickly dubbed him and Waterfield the murderous cousins, emphasizing the rarity of such a family tandem in criminal history. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence: confessions, testimony from surviving victims, recovered items, and expert reports. The jury found Gore guilty of murder, kidnapping, and other serious crimes. After a vote of 11-1, the court sentenced him to death. The state Supreme Court later upheld the sentence. Fred Waterfield also stood trial.
He denied his guilt, claiming that he was the victim of a hoax and did not participate in the crimes. However, the investigation established that the two acted together, supporting each other in planning and concealing the crimes. As a result, Waterfield received 2 life sentences. David Gore spent nearly 3 decades on death row. He wrote letters to journalists, priests, and researchers, claiming that he had come to terms with his actions and asking for forgiveness. However, the victims' families did not believe in his sincerity, believing that he was simply trying to soften his image before the execution of his sentence. On April 12, 2012, David Gore was executed by lethal injection at a Florida correctional facility. His last words were calm. "I'm sorry. I'm not the same person I was back then. I'm not afraid of death." For many, this was the final chapter in one of Florida's darkest stories, where evil had long been hidden behind a mask of law-abiding behavior and family ties. Paul John Knowles, born on April 25, 1946, in Orlando, Florida, grew up in a world of poverty, cruelty, and indifference. He spent his early years in foster homes and correctional facilities, where he was constantly subjected to violence and humiliation. Deprived of love and stability, Knowles learned early on that force and deception were the only ways to survive. As a teenager, he showed a tendency toward aggression and manipulation, and by the age of 19, he was behind bars for the first time, beginning a series of escapes, arrests, and short periods of freedom. Those who knew him in his youth described Paul as a charming and even charismatic man who knew how to win people over, hiding his cold indifference behind a smile. In early 1974, while in Rayford Prison, Knowles began corresponding with a divorced woman from California, Angela Chovich. Their letters quickly developed into a romantic relationship.
Convinced that she could save him, she hired a lawyer and secured his release. But their meeting in San Francisco was short and frightening. Chovich later said that she sensed an aura of danger from him and immediately broke off the relationship. Left alone, Knowles, in his own words, took a life for the first time that evening. This statement has never been proven, but it was from that moment that his bloody streak began, lasting several months. In the summer of 1974, he escaped from supervision and went on a journey through the southeastern states, from Florida to Georgia and Texas. His victims were random fellow travelers, women, families, and lone travelers. He acted without a plan, spontaneously, which made him especially dangerous. The motive, as criminologists later wrote, was not simply violence, but the need to control and demonstrate power.
Investigators from different states were unable to link the crimes for a long time. The locations, circumstances, and methods were too different. Only after some time did it become clear that all this was the work of one man, driven by rage and inner emptiness. In September 1974, Knowles killed an elderly couple traveling through Nevada, and shortly thereafter, a woman who picked him up on the highway in Texas. Then came new attacks, including one on a family in Connecticut. His movements resembled a chaotic flight, as if he himself did not know where he was going, but could not stop. The press dubbed him the I-95 killer, because many of the crimes took place near this highway. By November 1974, Paul Knowles had become one of America's most wanted criminals. He was included in the FBI's list of the 10 most dangerous fugitives. He constantly changed cars, used fake documents and identities, leaving a trail of chaos behind him.
In one incident, he kidnapped a woman who miraculously survived and later became the prosecution's key witness. After this incident, a large-scale manhunt began, bringing together police forces from several states. November 16, 1974, was a fateful day for Knowles. He was stopped by Patrol Officer Charles Campbell, who noticed a stolen car. A struggle ensued, during which the criminal seized the officer's weapon and took him hostage. He later killed the officer and a random driver, using his car to escape. This crime caused real alarm in the southeast of the country, and the authorities launched the largest manhunt in a decade to apprehend him. A day later, his run was over, after a chase and a shootout. Knowles was apprehended by a random witness, Vietnam War veteran David Clark, who held the criminal at gunpoint until the police arrived. The arrest became a sensation, and Knowles himself became a symbol of cold calculation and a broken personality.
He confessed to 18 murders and stated that he just did what he wanted. He later reported that he had recorded his confessions on audio cassettes and sent them to his lawyer. These recordings later became part of the investigation, but the originals were lost after a flood. The exact number of his victims has never been established.
Bobby Joe Long, born on October 14, 1953, in Canova, West Virginia, carried a combination of physical and psychological vulnerabilities from the very beginning of his life. He was born with a rare chromosomal abnormality, Klinefelter syndrome, 47XXY, which caused him to suffer from hormonal imbalances and feminine physical characteristics. Long was often teased as a child, which led to feelings of shame, inferiority, and alienation. Additional head injuries sustained in accidents exacerbated his emotional instability. He had a close and dependent relationship with his mother, who controlled his every move, which, according to psychologists, influenced his perception of women and the formation of an anxious personality. In 1974, Long married his high school girlfriend, and the couple had 2 children. However, behind the facade of family life lay outbursts of aggression and domineering behavior. His wife filed for divorce, accusing him of violence and constant humiliation.
After the breakup of his family, Long became withdrawn, frequently changing jobs and never staying anywhere for long. In the early 1980s, he moved to Florida, where his internal conflicts and hidden rage gradually turned into overt criminal acts. From 1983 to 1984, the Tampa area was gripped by a series of attacks on women that remained a mystery to the police for a long time. Waitresses, students, nurses, housewives, women leading ordinary lives disappeared. They were found days or weeks later in secluded places. The crimes were systematic and cold-blooded. Investigators later determined that one man was behind them all, Bobby Joe Long, who operated according to a specific pattern, carefully covering his tracks. The turning point came with the abduction of 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh in November 1984. On her way home from work, the girl was taken hostage by Long and held captive for more than a day. Showing incredible composure, Lisa managed to gain the criminal's trust and memorized every detail: his appearance, the interior of his house, his car, and even the places where he stopped. After Long unexpectedly released her, she immediately went to the police. Thanks to her testimony, investigators were able to identify the criminal. On November 16, 1984, Long was arrested near a movie theater in Tampa. Evidence was found in his car and home, red carpet fibers that matched those found on the victims' bodies. Further tests confirmed the DNA matches. During questioning, Long showed no emotion and confessed to 9 murders, although investigators linked him to at least 10. The victims were women between the ages of 18 and 33, many of whom had disappeared under similar circumstances. In 1985, Long made a deal with the prosecution, pleading guilty to 8 murders and 1 kidnapping. For this, he received 26 life sentences and several additional sentences without the right to parole. However, for the murder of Michelle Sims, the prosecution insisted on the death penalty. In 1986, the court handed down the final sentence: lethal injection. All subsequent appeals were rejected. Over decades in prison, Long remained virtually unchanged. He rarely gave interviews, but once said, "I acted on my feelings without thinking about the consequences." Psychologists noted his complete lack of empathy and remorse. Meanwhile, the story of Lisa McVeigh, who managed to survive captivity and help the police, became an example of strength of spirit and courage. She later joined the police force herself to help victims of violence. On May 23, 2019, 33 years after his conviction, Bobby Joe Long was executed in a Florida prison. He declined to make a final statement. His last meal consisted of roast beef, bacon, French fries, and soda. His time of death was recorded at 7:00 p.m.
William Devin Howell, born on February 11, 1970, in Norfolk, Virginia, did not stand out from the crowd. He worked as a handyman, sometimes as a driver, lived on odd jobs, and had no permanent home. People described him as a quiet and reserved person. But behind this outward reserve lay growing isolation, insecurity, and inner anger. Howell lived in an old van, which became not only his home, but also the place where the dark side of his personality manifested itself. His lifestyle seemed to be the result of poverty and instability, but over time it became the backdrop for a series of violent crimes. In 2003, Howell moved to Connecticut, where he did odd jobs in construction and lived on the outskirts of town. It was then that women began to disappear from New Britain and the surrounding areas. All of them belonged to vulnerable social groups. Some were struggling with addiction. Others found themselves on the streets without support.
Their disappearances went almost unnoticed, and Howell took advantage of this. He later confessed that he had been killing them for a year, and hiding their bodies in an overgrown area behind a shopping center in New Britain, which he called his garden. There, among the swamps and trees, he left the bodies, returning to the site from time to time, as if to revel in the satisfaction of his power. The investigation later established that his motives were not money or revenge. The crimes were committed out of a combination of addiction, loneliness, and a desire for control. 7 women became victims: Melanie Ruth Camellini, Diane Cusack, Mary Jane Menard, Marilyn Gonzalez, Nilsa Arismendi, Joyveline Martinez, and Janice Roberts, a transgender woman. All of them disappeared in 2003, and their fate remained unknown for a long time. The first clue came in 2004, when police were investigating the disappearance of Nilsa Arismendi. Her boyfriend said that the last time he saw her, she was getting into a blue van belonging to Howell. The vehicle was later found in North Carolina, where it underwent a thorough examination. Traces of blood were found under the carpet, which matched Arismendi's DNA. This was the first real evidence against him. On May 15, 2005, Howell was arrested in Virginia. Since the victims' bodies were not found, he was charged with only 1 count of manslaughter. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to a plea bargain and pleaded guilty under the Alford plea, receiving a 15-year prison sentence. But a few weeks later, a hunter stumbled upon human remains in the woods behind a shopping mall. A large-scale investigation began, uncovering one of the most horrific cases in Connecticut's history. Over the next few years, police discovered the remains of 7 women. Due to the swampy terrain and the time that had passed since the murders, identification took years.
It was not until 2015 that investigators were able to identify all of the victims. While in prison, Howell gradually began to share details with his cellmates. He called himself a sick ripper and said that a monster lived inside him. In some letters, he wrote that he lived with the body of one of his victims in a van because it was too cold outside to bury it. These confessions shocked even experienced investigators and psychologists. In November 2017, while already serving his previous sentence, Howell stood trial for 6 murders. He pleaded guilty and received 6 consecutive life sentences. Effectively, 360 years in prison. During the trial, he cried as he addressed the families of the victims, saying that his actions were monstrous and selfish. However, the victims' relatives did not believe in his remorse, believing that words could not atone for what he had done. Today, William Devin Howell is serving his sentence in Cheshire, Connecticut.
John Evander Coe was born on September 19, 1958, in Clay County, Florida. His childhood was marked by poverty, constant quarrels, and his parents' alcoholism. The house where he grew up rarely knew peace. Shouting, fighting, and indifference became a familiar part of his life. At school, Cowie was withdrawn and unsociable, and began to show signs of aggression and theft at an early age. As a teenager, he became involved with a group of older boys with whom he used illegal substances and committed petty theft. At the age of 18, he found himself behind bars for the first time. This first term was the beginning of a long list of offenses: theft, burglary, and assault. He was later convicted of a sexual offense against a child, but was released after a short prison term. Although he was required to register as a sex offender, supervision of him was minimal. By 2005, Coffey was living the life of an outcast. He lived in an old trailer in Homosassa, Florida, worked odd jobs, and avoided contact with his neighbors. People knew about his past, but had no idea how dangerous he could be. Among his neighbors was the Lansford family, who had a 9-year-old daughter named Jessica, a cheerful, friendly girl who loved music and dreamed of becoming a singer. On the night of February 24th, 2005, Cowie took advantage of the fact that the door to the Lansford's house was unlocked. According to him, he wanted to commit a theft. But when he saw the child, he gave in to an impulse that turned into tragedy. He kidnapped Jessica and held her captive for several days. All this time, the police and hundreds of volunteers combed the area, and photos of the girl filled news feeds and screens across Florida. Her disappearance shocked the state's residents, causing a wave of sympathy and concern. Investigators worked around the clock, checking dozens of suspects. Attention quickly turned to Cowie, who lived just a few meters from the Lansford family and was listed in the database as a convicted felon. He was questioned but released without direct evidence. It was only a few days later, during a search of his stepsister's home, that police found evidence: blood-stained pillows and a mattress. DNA testing confirmed that the biological material matched that of Cowie and Jessica. On March 17, 2005, he was arrested in Georgia, where he had attempted to flee. The next day, he confessed to the kidnapping and death of the child, stating that he acted without a plan. This testimony was recorded on video and became a central element of the prosecution's case. 2 days after his arrest, on March 19th, the girl's body was found near his home. The news sparked a wave of anger and grief, with thousands of people taking to the streets with posters in support of the Lansford family.
The Citrus County Prosecutor's Office brought charges of kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. To avoid public pressure, the trial was moved to Miami. The trial began on March 7, 2007. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence: forensic results, confession recordings, and witness testimony. The defense tried to convince the court that Cowie suffered from mental disorders, but an independent examination established that his intelligence and awareness allowed him to understand the consequences of his actions. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours and unanimously found him guilty. 2 weeks later, the judge handed down the sentence: death penalty and 3 consecutive life sentences. The public applauded this decision. For many, it was a symbol of justice being restored. However, the sentence was never carried out. On September 30th, 2009, while on death row, John Cowie died of a heart attack.
Craig Chandler Price was born on October 11th, 1973, in Warwick, Rhode Island. He grew up in a poor but hard-working African-American family, where his parents tried to provide their children with everything they needed, despite constant financial difficulties. His father worked in a warehouse, his mother in a hospital, and their home was simple but stable. However, Craig's character showed disturbing traits from childhood: outbursts of rage, a penchant for petty theft, and a desire to dominate other children. Teachers described him as an intelligent but disobedient teenager, prone to resentment and aggression. He often complained of discrimination and felt isolated from his peers, which intensified his inner anger. At the age of 13, Price began using marijuana and psychoactive substances, started skipping school, and spending nights away from home. His parents thought it was just a teenage crisis, but his behavior quickly spiraled out of control. He became large and physically strong, which made him dangerous even to adults. On the night of July 27, 1987, Price committed his first murder, an attack on his neighbor Rebecca Spencer. He acted in a state of rage, unaware of the consequences. The crime shocked the city, but remained unsolved for a long time. The police could not believe that such a horrific act could have been committed by a teenager. 2 years later, On September 1st, 1989, Price attacked again, this time targeting his neighbor Joan Heaton and her 2 daughters. At that time, he was only 15 years old. This crime shocked the entire country. The scale of the cruelty seemed incompatible with the age of the perpetrator. When the police arrested Craig, he showed no fear or remorse. On the contrary, he spoke about his actions with cold indifference, claiming that he felt relieved. Investigators were stunned. They were not dealing with a normal teenager, but with a person completely devoid of empathy. The Rhode Island legal system at the time was not prepared for such a case. Since Price was a minor, he could not be tried as an adult, and the maximum sentence was only 6 years, until he reached the age of 21. Realizing this, Craig openly mocked the law and boasted that he would soon be released. These statements became a catalyst for public outrage. In response to the scandal, state authorities changed the law, allowing minors to be tried as adults for particularly serious crimes. But this law could no longer be applied to Price. Psychiatrists who observed him at the juvenile center described Craig as a person with severe disorders, impulsive, prone to violence, but intellectually intact. He refused to participate in rehabilitation programs, mocked psychologists, and provoked other inmates. Upon reaching adulthood, Price was supposed to be released, but due to public pressure and new violations in prison, his sentence was extended. He repeatedly attacked guards, participated in fights, and refused therapy. The public organization Citizens Against the Release of Craig Price campaigned for his continued detention, claiming that he remained a threat to society. In 2004, due to his constant acts of aggression, he was transferred to Florida to a prison with a stricter regime. But even there, Price did not change. In 2009, he wounded a prison employee, and in 2017, he attacked a cellmate, for which he received an additional 25-year sentence. Today, Craig Chandler Price remains in prison and is considered one of Rhode Island's most notorious criminals. His story has become an example of how a juvenile offender can change the legal system of an entire state, becoming a symbol of the need to toughen penalties for particularly serious crimes. Stephen Lorenzo was born in Florida in the 1960s. His childhood was not marked by cruelty or poverty, but from an early age he displayed traits that indicated an inner imbalance, a desire to control others, superficial charm, and hidden emotional coldness. In his youth, he tried to win the attention of those around him and be at the center of events. But inside, he felt isolated and misunderstood. Over the years, this inner emptiness grew into an obsessive desire for power. As an adult, Lorenzo lived in Tampa and became a prominent figure in the local gay community. A sociable, well-groomed, confident man who easily won people over. But behind his attractive appearance was a man who manipulated others to satisfy his hidden needs. In the early 2000s, Lorenzo met Scott Schweikert, a man who shared his interest in control. Together, they formed a sinister alliance that marked the beginning of a series of crimes. They used dating sites and parties to lure men to their home, presenting themselves as friendly and hospitable. After a friendly chat, they offered their guests drinks laced with powerful drugs. Under the influence of the drugs, the victims lost consciousness and then became victims of violence. These crimes remained undetected by the police for a long time, until 2 men, Jason Galhouse and Michael Wachholz, disappeared in Tampa at the end of 2003. Their disappearance caused alarm, but at first was not linked to the other cases. It was only several months later, in 2004, that several men filed reports of assaults. describing the same pattern: meeting someone, being offered a drink, losing consciousness, and then feeling terror and helplessness. The investigation turned its attention to Lorenzo and Schweikert. During a search of Lorenzo's home, the police found shocking evidence: video recordings of scenes of violence. These files were a turning point. They proved that these were not random attacks, but systematic crimes. Among the recordings, investigators found footage of Jason Gale House, which confirmed the suspect's involvement in his disappearance. Initially, both were charged with federal counts of kidnapping and drug use. It was only years later, when the investigation was complete, that the Hillsborough County Prosecutor's Office brought first-degree murder charges. In 2012, Schweikert agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing detailed information about the crimes and admitting that Lorenzo had played a leading role. In exchange, he received a life sentence. His testimony helped reconstruct the events of December 2003 and January 2004, when both men, Galehouse and Wachholtz, were kidnapped and tortured. Lorenzo himself denied his guilt for many years. He used legal loopholes, filed dozens of appeals and complaints, represented himself in court, and dragged out the process. However, in November 2022, everything changed. He unexpectedly pleaded guilty and submitted a 147-page handwritten confession to the judge. In it, he described in detail how he lured men, abused them, and took their lives, claiming that he realized what he had done and deserved the death penalty. In February 2023, the Hillsborough County Court found Stephen Lorenzo guilty and sentenced him to death. This verdict was the final chapter in a case that had dragged on for almost 2 decades. The victims' families, who were present in the courtroom, said they felt relief for the first time in many years. The Florida Supreme Court later upheld the verdict, closing the case for good. Today, Stephen Lorenzo is on death row in a Florida state prison. His story is an example of how absolute cruelty can be hidden behind outward politeness and charm, and a reminder that evil can masquerade as ordinary kindness.
John Ruthel. Henry was born on January 16, 1951, in Florida. His childhood was marked by poverty, violence, and constant fear. His father was quick-tempered and often raised his hand against the family, while his mother suffered from addiction and was unable to protect her children. In these conditions, John grew up withdrawn and anxious, often displaying outbursts of uncontrollable rage. As a teenager, he dropped out of school, began using alcohol and drugs, and soon came to the attention of the police. Despite his difficult personality, Henry appeared to be a quiet and calm person, which helped him quickly gain trust, especially among women. However, behind this mask was a man who was unable to control his emotions. Henry committed his first murder in the summer of 1975. His common-law wife, 28-year-old Patricia Roddy, fell victim to a sudden outburst of rage. During an argument in the car, he attacked her with a knife and, realizing what he had done, fled.
He was later arrested by Deputy Sheriff Fay Wilbur, an officer whose name would reappear in his case years later. At trial, Henry pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for second-degree murder. After serving half his sentence, he was released on parole, a decision that would later cause widespread public outrage. After his release in 1983, Henry tried to start over. He married 28-year-old saleswoman Suzanne Overstreet, mother of 4-year-old Eugene, affectionately known as Buggy. At first, the family seemed happy, but soon John's old habits returned. He was jealous, abused alcohol, and often lashed out, accusing his wife of infidelity. The house gradually turned into a battleground. Suzanne repeatedly sought refuge in a women's shelter and tried to obtain a restraining order, fearing for her life and that of her child. On December 22nd, 1985, Henry came to her house under the pretext of buying Christmas presents.
At first, the conversation was peaceful, but soon, an argument broke out. Giving in to rage, he grabbed a knife and killed Suzanne. After that, acting in a state of alienation, he took his son and left the house. The next day, the police found the woman's body, and soon after, the boys. Their deaths shocked the whole of Florida. The police quickly tracked down Henry. He was arrested by the same Fay Wilbur who had detained him 10 years earlier. During questioning, John confessed to everything without resistance and indicated the location where he had left the child's body. His cold composure and lack of visible emotion shocked even experienced investigators. The trials were held in different counties, one for the murder of his son and one for the murder of his wife. The public demanded the maximum punishment. Lawyers tried to prove that Henry was mentally ill, citing his low IQ, around 70, and childhood trauma. But experts unanimously stated that he understood the nature of his actions. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death in both cases. Later, the Florida Supreme Court overturned one of the convictions due to procedural violations, but the new trial ended with the same result. For nearly 30 years, lawyers tried to obtain a pardon, but all appeals were rejected. In June 2014, Governor Rick Scott signed an order to carry out the sentence. On June 18th, John Rutel Henry was given a lethal injection at a Florida state prison. He declined a last meal and uttered a few short words. "I can't change what I did. If I could, I would. I'm sorry." Stephen Todd Booker was born on September 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His early years were spent in poverty, constantly moving and lacking stability. His parents struggled to survive, but their family life was falling apart before their eyes. Even as a child, Stephen was drawn to books and showed high intelligence. But the street environment proved stronger. From his teenage years, he began stealing, drinking alcohol, and using drugs, as well as getting into minor trouble with the law. At 14, he dropped out of school, unable to cope with his addiction and anger. He later joined the army, where he served in Japan. There, he tried heroin for the first time, which completely changed his life. After returning to the United States, Booker led a double life, outwardly calm, well-read, even charming, but inside addicted, irritable, and prone to outbursts of rage. In 1974, he was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison.
After his parole, he moved to Florida, where he tried to start a new life, but soon fell back into addiction and a life of crime. On November 9th, 1977, a crime occurred in Gainesville that shocked the entire state of Florida. 94-year-old Lauren Demas Harmon was found in her apartment. At the scene, investigators found signs of violence, disorder, and a struggle. The examination showed that the victim had died from multiple stab wounds, and the room looked as if the perpetrator had been searching for something valuable. Fingerprints, hair, and shoe prints matched those of Stephen Booker. He was arrested the very next day. During questioning, Booker behaved strangely, claiming that the murder was not committed by him, but by his alter ego, named Aniel. Psychiatrists later determined that he did not have a personality disorder. It was an attempt to avoid responsibility.
At the trial, Booker claimed that he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, was not aware of his actions, and was in a state of delirium. In December 1977, he was charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial began in the summer of 1978 and lasted several weeks. The prosecution presented compelling evidence, clues, DNA material, witness testimony, and expert opinions. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and on June 22nd, recommended the death penalty by a majority vote, 9-3. On October 20th, Judge John Cruz upheld the sentence, adding long prison terms for the other crimes. In the years that followed, Booker became a regular participant in court proceedings. His lawyers filed dozens of appeals, claiming that the court had violated the defendant's rights, misused psychological reports, and shown the jury overly emotional photographs. However, the Florida Supreme Court and federal courts consistently upheld the sentence. In 1991, one of the motions was granted. The court agreed to reconsider the sentence. But in 1998, the verdict was the same. Death by a majority vote, 8-4. After the sentence was finally upheld in 2001, Stephen Todd Booker remained in Rayford Prison, where he spent more than half his life awaiting execution. His story became an example of how intelligence and talent can be destroyed by addiction, inner demons, and the choice of a path of violence. Until the last years of his life, he continued to write letters, read books, and correspond with journalists, insisting that something else lived in him back then. Stephen Booker died in prison awaiting execution, never seeing the final court decision. For many, his story became a grim reminder of how even an intelligent and gifted person can turn into a monster under the influence of addiction, rage, and a sense of impunity.
Don Charles Spirit was born on February 23rd, 1963, in a small town in Florida. His life was difficult from the very beginning. He grew up in poverty, encountered cruelty and hopelessness at an early age, and spent his teenage years in a company where guns and alcohol were part of everyday life. Despite his natural intelligence and hard work ethic, Don was unable to break out of the vicious cycle. By the age of 20, he had several arrests for possession of illegal substances and petty theft. Those who knew him personally recalled that he could be kind and caring, especially with children. But sometimes there was a dark look in his eyes, as if he were struggling with himself. In 2001, a tragedy occurred that changed the lives of the entire Spirit family. While hunting, Don accidentally shot and killed his 8-year-old son, Kyle. The man admitted that it was an accident, but was convicted of weapons possession because he already had a criminal record. He spent 3 years in prison. After his release, he lived with a sense of guilt, often repeating that God had taken everything from him and that he would never be the same again. Neighbors recalled that after that he became withdrawn, irritable, and often talked about the meaninglessness of life. After his release, Don settled in Bell, Gilchrist County, with his adult daughter Sarah Lorraine Spirit and her 6 children. Sarah had her first child as a teenager, later went through several failed relationships, and returned to her father, hoping for support. According to neighbors, the house was noisy but lively. Children ran around in the yard. Don often repaired appliances and grilled meat. However, behind this outward appearance lay conflicts. The police were called more than once to respond to complaints of family quarrels and possible substance abuse. On September 18, 2014, the 911 service received an alarming call.
A man with a trembling voice said that something terrible had happened. When the officers arrived at the scene, they saw a spirit near the house. He looked depressed and confused. After a brief conversation, he went back inside, and soon a gunshot rang out from the house. Police found that no one inside had survived. The tragedy claimed the lives of Sarah and her 6 children, the youngest of whom was only 10 weeks old. The investigation determined that Spirit was acting in a state of severe emotional crisis. Experts later suggested that he was suffering from deep depression and psychotic disorder with delusions of guilt.
Friends and relatives noted that in recent weeks he had looked exhausted, often saying that he had lost everything and could no longer live like this. After the tragedy in Bell, the public demanded answers. Why was a man with a criminal record, known for his unstable behavior, not under constant supervision by the authorities? Social welfare officials acknowledged that the Spirit family was indeed under supervision, but there were no serious grounds for removing the children. This sparked a wave of discussion about the shortcomings of the system and the importance of psychiatric care for people who have experienced severe loss. Psychologists who analyzed the case described Don Spirit's actions as an act of family self-destruction, a rare phenomenon in which a person in a state of deep despair convinces themselves that they are relieving their loved ones from suffering. However, investigators did not rule out that his actions may have been influenced by a conflict with his daughter, which had escalated shortly before the tragedy. Spirit's story became one of the most shocking pages in Florida's crime history, not because of the scale of the crime, but because it was committed by a man whom many considered kind, but broken. This tragedy served as a reminder of how important it is to notice the signs of inner turmoil in time and not leave a person alone with their pain.